This is part 2 of Public Opinion, screencast for my AP Government class. Hello! Part 2. So, types of polls that exist. This is a very basic list, but we look at push polls, tracking polls, and exit polls. Push polls are types of polls that try to influence a voter to vote one way or another, usually negatively against a candidate. So the term says polls taken for the purpose of providing information on an opponent that would lead respondents to vote against their candidate. If you get a poll like this, normally they will start with a similar statement. If you knew that candidate X was arrested for spousal abuse, would you vote for him in the next election? They're leading the person to answer negatively towards someone and fishing for information to see if that issue would bother voters. So that's known as a push poll because they're trying to seek out information. The second type is called a tracking poll. Now, a tracking poll is what we have been following day to day in class. Who's ahead on the Democratic side for presidential race in 2016? Who's ahead on the Republican side? We checked Real Clear Politics quite often in class to see who is ahead, who's in the polls, and what the new numbers are for the day. So the definition says continuous surveys that enable a campaign to chart its daily rise or fall. This often is called the horse race mentality. Who's ahead? And newspapers can do this. TV stations like Fox News or CNN, they consistently put out tracking polls. A third type of poll is called an exit poll, and this is similar to the data that we have researched. Exit polls are more informal because they are targeting people coming out of the polling place on election day. What happens is a person stops and says, would you be willing to take this poll? Can we answer or can we ask you a few questions? And if the people agree, then they ask it. This is very influential for early results on election day. If you turn it on and the polls don't close till 7, if you turn the TV on or look at Twitter, it'll say early exit polls say blah, blah, blah is ahead. And that's how we sort of check the pulse of the nation on election day. This is very similar to a straw poll. A straw poll could be your fourth type of poll. It's very informal. They're just asking you, based on this information, would you choose A or choice B? The newspaper likes to do this a lot. Call-in programs like to do this. Twitter is even getting into the polling. Take this daily poll and give us your feedback. So those are different types that exist. So let's look at shortcomings of polls. Polls are great, but there is a science to them, and sometimes they can be misleading. The largest part is just misinformation to the public, that the public believes one thing and the polls don't reflect that sentiment. In the presidential election of 2000, the news reported and went ahead and said that Florida was going to be won by Al Gore, the Democratic candidate. The media based that on early exit polls and called the state for Florida for Al Gore. And it led to some confusion because the polls weren't closed yet. People thought Gore was ahead, but then they took that statement back and they said, okay, we're sorry, we're taking that back. Now we're going to call the state for George W. Bush. And then they called that back and said, it is too early to tell. So something along those lines took place where they were calling it, taking it back. It led to misinformation, which was really chaotic on election night. The next thing that you need to look at is the sampling error or margin of error. Before you even study a poll, look at the title, look how many respondents there are, and a good sample size is 1,000 to 1,500. You have to make sure that it's a good cross-section of the population that you are surveying. Also note the plus or minus number. It's usually given at the bottom of a poll. A good poll will have a statistic number at the bottom. It'll say plus or minus 4, plus or minus 3. A solid poll is around plus or minus 3. That means the margin of error can go 3 up on the number or 3 down. So if you have a candidate and it's 47% for candidate A and 53% for candidate B, it's almost a statistical tie because that number could go up plus or minus 3. The higher the minus number, the less reliable the poll. So keep that in mind when checking polls out. The next shortcoming of a poll when they give it, if there are poor answer choices, you're not going to get a good reflection of what the poll is really trying to find out. So this is called limited respondent options. What if a pollster called and said, do you like or dislike the president? And you might say, well, I mean, I like them as a person. I like their domestic policies, but I disagree with his foreign policy. Well, that question can't measure that. And so sometimes people are like, is there a choice in the middle? If you offer too few choices, people don't know how to accurately respond because they're torn. So sometimes more choices leads to a better chance of getting a true opinion of the public. Lack of information by the person is another shortcoming. If individuals are uninformed and they guess, you're not going to get accurate results. And the last one, intensity of the issue. If nobody cares about what you're polling about, you're probably not going to get a good, true cross-section of public opinion. For example, when the war broke out in Iraq, when George W. Bush was sending troops in, it was pretty intense. And daily we were asked the question about sending troops in on the war issue. Well, what if another poll happened at the same time in a non-presidential year and they said, should we change the Electoral College? Well, nobody may care about that issue at that certain time. So you have to be careful about the poll when you're asking it and what you're trying to find out. The last thing I want you to do, this says, how does polling and public opinion affect politicians and particularly public policy? So when I stop this section, I'm going to put another clip on the website on Classroom, and I want you to watch it. And it's a video clip of President Obama's pollster and what he does with the information and how he uses it to influence the president. Politicians often take the pulse of the public through polling. It's one of their best ways to stay connected with it. But you can also turn a poll to your advantage if you're trying to get something passed. One example of how President Clinton used polling is on crime bill. And the American public had identified the number one problem in America was crime. And so Clinton, as part of his domestic program, made stopping crime one of his priorities, which resulted in the Clinton crime bill of 1994. Politicians also rely on polls, but not always. Some don't want to know the pulse of the public because they have to make a quick decision, or they know circumstances that the American public doesn't, so they rely on their own opinion, and sometimes that just happens due to the nature of the presidency. Polls can also create a bandwagon effect or an underdog effect, especially in early stages of a campaign. I think that's been most evident during the Democrat and Republican primaries and the debates that we have been watching. Daily in the news polls, Trump has been ahead by 20 points, 30 points, and it's creating this bandwagon effect that Trump is going to be the Republican nominee before we've even voted. And so the public is seeing that perception day in and day out, and they're going to think he's probably the only one that can win. It can also create the underdog effect, where you have a popular candidate, but they're not polling well, so you might think they should just drop out. Somebody who might have 1 to 5%, but maybe they're going to do better in the election in certain states. So you have to watch that too and be careful of always relying exactly on polls. So I'm going to stop it at this point. I want you to go back and watch that video clip of Obama's pollster, and then you will be done with this portion of the notes.